Sign it, or I will tie you up in court for years, my husband warned, thrusting a thick stack of legal documents at me. We were standing inside the expansive kitchen of the $4 million home I had paid for entirely by myself. He wore a smug, self-satisfied grin, completely convinced that forcing me out of this mansion would finally break my spirit. I looked at him, then looked down at the papers. I calmly picked up my pen signed on the dotted line, set my house keys on the marble counter, and walked away without shedding a single tear. By sunrise the very next morning, his own lawyer would be shouting at him through the phone, demanding to know if he even understood the magnitude of what I had just handed him. My name is Nia, and at 36 years old, I am the chief executive officer of a highly successful commercial real estate brokerage. I spent my entire adult life building an empire from the ground up, pulling myself out of the south side of Chicago to sit at tables where people who looked like me were rarely invited. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic situation and leave the trash exactly where it belongs. Trust me, you are going to want to hear exactly how this pristine $4 million trap snapped shut. It was a chilly Friday evening when my soon-to-be ex-husband, Marcus, decided to stage his grand coup. I had just returned home from a grueling 12-hour day of negotiating property acquisitions. The house was quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that usually precedes a disaster. I walked into the kitchen, dropping my leather tote bag onto the custom Calcutta marble island that I had personally flown to Italy to select. The kitchen was my sanctuary, a masterpiece of modern design, with sleek, dark oak cabinetry and state-of-the-art appliances that Marcus barely knew how to turn on. He was waiting for me sitting on one of the velvet bar stools, holding a manila folder. Marcus was a 38-year-old sales director who spent more time polishing his image and buying flashy designer suits than actually closing deals. He had always been intimidated by my ambition, but over the past year, his insecurity had morphed into deep resentment. When I discovered he was funneling money from our joint savings account to finance lavish vacations for his 24-year-old mistress, I immediately filed for divorce. I thought we would handle it quietly through our attorneys. I underestimated his greed. Marcus slammed the manila folder onto the marble countertop. Inside was a quitclaim deed drafted by his aggressive new legal team. He stood up, puffing out his chest, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me the way he always did when he felt intellectually outmatched. He told me that if I did not sign over the deed to the house right then and there, he would drag my name through the mud. He threatened to claim a massive stake in my commercial brokerage, demanding half of my business assets and fighting me for years in family court until my legal fees bled me dry. He smirked, looking around the luxurious kitchen, telling me I could keep my little company, but this house belonged to him now. He said it was the least I owed him for emasculating him all these years with my long work hours and endless business trips. I stared at the thick stack of papers. The sheer audacity of his demand was almost amusing, but I kept my face perfectly blank. I knew exactly what kind of reaction he wanted. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to cry and beg him not to take the home I had poured my heart and soul into. He wanted the angry black woman stereotype to manifest so he could feel justified in his cruelty. But I did not give him a single ounce of that satisfaction. I simply reached into my purse and pulled out my favorite gold-plated fountain pen. Before the pen could even touch the paper, the heavy oak double doors of the kitchen swung open. In walked his younger sister Chloe and her husband Brad. They were already celebrating, holding crystal flute glasses and a bottle of expensive champagne that I had purchased for a completely different occasion. Chloe had always been the golden child of her family, constantly praised for her looks, while contributing absolutely nothing of substance to the world. She had always envied my wardrobe, my bank account, and my independence, masking her jealousy with backhanded compliments and fake concern. Her husband Brad was a different story altogether. Brad was a white, supposed finance bro who worked at some low-tier brokerage firm playing the role of a Wall Street tycoon while drowning in undisclosed debt. He possessed a level of unearned arrogance that made my skin crawl, and he never missed an opportunity to remind me that I was an outsider in their pristine, affluent circle. Brad popped the champagne cork, letting it bounce off the custom ceiling. He poured a glass for Marcus and one for Chloe, deliberately ignoring me. He leaned against my expensive stainless steel refrigerator, giving me a patronizing smile. "You know, Nia, it really is for the best," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You never truly fit into this neighborhood anyway. You can take the girl out of the South Side, but you just cannot take the South Side out of the girl. This house needs someone with actual class to host the summer galas, not someone who smells like hustle and desperation all the time." Your lack of pedigree was starting to dirty the floors. Chloe took a sip of her champagne and let out a soft, calculated laugh. "Do not be too harsh on her, Brad," she chimed in, placing a perfectly manicured hand on her brother's shoulder. "Nia worked so hard. It is just a terrible shame she could not figure out how to keep a man happy. Marcus deserves a home, a real home filled with warmth and proper home-cooked meals. Not just a giant property managed by a tired woman who works 80 hours a week and thinks her paycheck makes up for her lack of femininity. You should just sign the papers, Nia, and go find a nice little condo back where you belong." The sheer venom in their words would have broken me 5 years ago. I would have argued, defended my honor, and tried to explain that, without my 80-hour work weeks, none of them would be standing in this gorgeous home drinking my vintage champagne. But I had evolved far beyond the need to explain my worth to people committed to misunderstanding me. I looked at Brad, taking in his cheap, heavily starched collar and his desperate need to feel superior. I looked at Chloe, who was wearing a diamond tennis bracelet she had practically begged me to buy for her last birthday. And finally, I looked at Marcus, the man I had once vowed to love and protect, who was now grinning like he had just won the lottery. They were a pack of wolves who thought they had finally cornered their prey, but they had absolutely no idea that they had just wandered blindfolded into a minefield. I uncapped my fountain pen. The gold nib caught the warm light of the chandelier above the island. I smoothed out the final page of the quitclaim deed. Without a single word, I signed my name in fluid looping cursive. The ink was dark and permanent. I flipped to the next page and signed again. I initialed every single section they demanded. The silence in the kitchen was deafening, save for the soft scratching of my pen against the thick legal paper. Marcus watched me, his smug expression faltering for a brief second, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He had prepared for a massive fight. My total compliance was unnerving him, but his massive ego quickly overrode his intuition. When the final signature was complete, I capped my pen and placed it back into my leather tote bag. I slowly unclipped my keychain, separating the heavy gold house key and the garage fob from the rest of my keys. I held them up for a moment, letting the metal catch the light, before dropping them onto the marble counter. The sharp, metallic clink echoed loudly in the quiet room. "The house is all yours, Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly steady and dangerously calm. "I hope it brings you exactly what you deserve. Enjoy the maintenance." I grabbed the handle of my Louis Vuitton rolling suitcase that I had packed and hidden in the coat closet earlier that afternoon. The wheels glided silently over the polished hardwood floors as I walked past the three of them. I did not look back. I did not hurl a single insult. I simply walked out the front door and pulled it shut behind me. The heavy, solid wood door closed with a firm thud, echoing like the final strike of a judge's gavel. It was the sound of my absolute freedom. They stood in that beautiful kitchen holding their champagne flutes, basking in the glorious illusion of their victory. They thought they had successfully stripped me of my greatest asset and left me with nothing but a suitcase and a bruised ego. They had no idea that they had just gleefully swallowed a deadly financial poison, and the countdown to their absolute ruin had already begun. The crisp night air hit my face the moment I stepped off the expansive front porch of the estate. I walked down the sweeping cobblestone driveway toward my matte black Range Rover. I did not look back at the grand bay windows where I knew Marcus, Brad, and Chloe were likely pouring another round of my expensive champagne. I pressed the unlock button on my key fob and the heavy door of the SUV opened with a satisfying solid clunk. I tossed my Louis Vuitton suitcase into the back seat, climbed behind the steering wheel, and pressed the ignition. The engine roared to life, a low, powerful rumble that perfectly matched the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. I pulled out of the gated community, the heavy iron gates closing behind me for the absolute last time. The quiet luxury of the suburban streets gave way to the sleek neon glow of the highway leading straight into the heart of the city. I reached out and tapped the digital display on my dashboard. Call Valerie. The Bluetooth system chimed twice before my executive assistant answered. Valerie was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had been my right hand since I first launched my commercial brokerage. She knew my business inside and out, and more importantly, she knew exactly what I had been planning for the last 48 hours. Is it done? Valerie asked, her voice crisp and alert despite the late hour. I merged onto the highway, gripping the leather steering wheel. It is done, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. He signed every single page. He actually thought he was intimidating me into surrendering the property. He had his little cheering section there, too. Chloe and Brad were practically throwing a parade in my kitchen. Valerie let out a sharp laugh that filled the quiet cabin of my car. They are going to need that champagne to swallow the reality check they are about to receive. Did he read the clauses at all, Nia? Of course not, I said, shaking my head, even though she could not see me. Marcus has never read a legal document in his life. He saw the words, quitclaim deed, and assumed he had just won the lottery. He is too arrogant to believe I would ever outsmart him. He genuinely believes that my money is his money simply because he managed to put a ring on my finger. That right there was the crux of the entire marriage. Marcus loved the lifestyle my income provided, but he despised the woman who earned it. I had purchased that $4 million home entirely with my own capital. Every brick, every slab of marble, every perfectly manicured blade of grass was paid for by the sweat of my brow and the closing of my commercial real estate deals. Marcus contributed absolutely nothing to the mortgage. His salary as a mid-level sales director barely covered his luxury car lease and his tailored suits. Yet for the past year, he had been systematically siphoning funds from our joint savings account. He thought he was being incredibly clever, making small, untraceable withdrawals to finance boutique hotel stays and designer handbags for a 24-year-old Pilates instructor who barely knew his real age. When my private investigator handed me the glossy photographs of Marcus and his mistress dining at a high-end steakhouse on my dime, I did not shatter into a million pieces. I did not confront him with screaming matches or tear-stained ultimatums. I am a businesswoman. When an investment becomes toxic, you do not cry over it. You restructure your assets, and you cut the liability loose. Marcus had become a massive liability, and I was going to ensure his exit was as painful as his betrayal. Valerie broke the silence, pulling me out of my thoughts. So we are officially moving to phase 2 then? Yes, I said, pressing my foot down on the accelerator. I need you to draft the email to his attorney, David Ross. Attach the complete tax file, the original property deed, and the corporate restructuring documents. But do not send it right now. I want you to schedule that email to hit Ross' inbox at exactly 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. I want David Ross to be sipping his first cup of coffee when he realizes his client just committed financial suicide. Understood, Valerie replied, typing rapidly on her keyboard in the background. I am reviewing the attachments now, the LLC transfer forms and the 1031 exchange documentation are all here. Nia, this is absolutely brilliant. He has no idea that the house is not a residential property on paper. He has no idea about anything, I said, a cold smile finally breaking across my face. Marcus was so obsessed with taking my home that he never bothered to look up how it was legally structured. 3 years ago, when his spending habits first started becoming reckless, I transferred the deed of that house into a commercial holding company. I structured the entire $4 million estate as a limited liability company, utilizing a federal 1031 exchange to defer the capital gains taxes from my previous commercial sales. That house is not a marital asset. It is a corporate entity bound by strict federal tax codes. By forcing me to sign that quitclaim deed and transferring the property back into his personal name, Marcus had just triggered a catastrophic taxable event. He had completely destroyed the protective shell of the LLC. The moment his pen hit that paper, he violated the terms of the federal tax deferment. But the tax penalty was not even the best part. Make sure you highlight page 12 for David Ross. I instructed, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Highlight the acceleration clause on the Small Business Administration loan. I am looking at it right now, Valerie said, her tone filled with absolute awe. By transferring ownership without the consent of the commercial lender, the entire balance of the loan becomes due immediately. Nia, he just took on $3.5 million in federal debt. Exactly, I replied. The bank will demand payment in full within 30 days. If he cannot produce $3.5 million in cash, the IRS will freeze his bank accounts, garnish his wages, and place federal liens on everything he touches. He thought he was taking my sanctuary, but what he actually did was chain himself to a sinking ship with no life vest. He cannot afford the property taxes, let alone a multi-million-dollar federal loan. Valerie sighed, a sound of pure satisfaction. The email is drafted and scheduled for 6 a.m. sharp. Where are you going to stay tonight, Nia? Do you need me to book a suite at the Four Seasons? No need, I told her, the tension finally leaving my shoulders. I am heading to the new penthouse downtown, the one I closed on last month under the new corporate trust. My bags are already unpacked, and the view of the skyline is spectacular. Go to sleep, Valerie. Tomorrow is going to be a very busy day. I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. The cabin of the SUV fell silent again, save for the soft hum of the tires against the asphalt. For the first time in over a decade, I felt entirely weightless. I was no longer carrying the crushing burden of a man whose ego was heavier than his ambition. I was no longer shrinking myself to make a mediocre man feel tall. I had played the obedient, devastated wife perfectly. I had let them mock my roots, my work ethic, and my character. I gave them exactly the performance they needed to feel victorious. The dark sky outside my window slowly began to change color. The deep indigo of the night gave way to soft streaks of purple and gold. As I navigated the sweeping curves of the highway, the towering skyscrapers of downtown Chicago came into view, reflecting the very first light of dawn. The city was waking up, completely unaware of the absolute storm that was about to hit the suburbs. I pulled my Range Rover into the secure underground garage of my new luxury high-rise. I parked the car, grabbed my suitcase, and rode the private elevator all the way up to the top floor. When the polished steel doors slid open, I stepped into a massive modern penthouse bathed in the golden light of the morning sun. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the world I had conquered. I walked over to the massive glass window and looked out at the horizon. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. Somewhere across the city, a high-powered attorney was opening an email that would turn his arrogant client's life into an inescapable nightmare. A slow, satisfied smirk spread across my lips as the sun finally crested over the edge of the world. The trap had officially snapped shut, and the hunt had just begun. I did not have to be physically present in the suburbs to know exactly how Marcus spent his morning. The security system I had installed years ago was still fully active and connected to my phone, giving me a pristine view of the sweeping hallways and the marble kitchen. I watched the recorded clips later that day, and my attorney gave me a play-by-play of the explosive phone call that shattered my ex-husband's reality. At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, the bright morning sunlight was pouring through the custom silk drapes of the master bedroom. Marcus was sprawled across the center of the California king bed, wrapped in the expensive 1,000-thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets that I had personally ordered from a boutique in Paris. He woke up feeling like an absolute conqueror. In his delusional mind, he had successfully bullied his high-earning wife into surrendering a multi-million-dollar asset without a single fight. He probably spent the first few minutes of his morning staring at the ornate tray ceiling, calculating how much equity he could borrow against the estate to fund his lavish lifestyle and keep his young mistress completely satisfied. He thought he was sitting on a gold mine. Then his phone began to ring. The harsh, vibrating sound echoed loudly against the solid oak nightstand. Marcus reached over without opening his eyes, assuming it was one of his golf buddies, or perhaps Chloe calling to gloat about my departure over morning mimosas. He grabbed the phone and saw the caller identification on the bright screen. It was David Ross, his aggressive, high-priced divorce attorney. Marcus swiped the screen to answer and confidently put the phone on speaker, resting it on his chest. He expected his lawyer to congratulate him on securing the deed so quickly. He expected praise for his brilliant negotiation skills. Instead, a voice full of sheer panic and unbridled rage exploded through the tiny phone speaker. "Wake up, you absolute idiot!" Ross screamed, his voice cracking with intensity. "Get out of that bed right now and tell me exactly what you signed last night." Marcus jolted awake, completely stunned by the sheer hostility coming from a man he was paying $500 an hour to represent him. He sat up, pushing the heavy down comforter off his chest, his heart suddenly pounding against his ribs. He tried to maintain his typical arrogant posture, even though there was no one in the room to see it. "David, calm down," Marcus said, rubbing his eyes. "I handled the situation perfectly. I got her to sign the quitclaim deed. She surrendered the house to me. We do not even need to fight over it in court anymore. You should be thanking me for saving you the paperwork." "Thanking you!" Ross roared, the sound of him slamming his fist against a heavy wooden desk echoing through the phone line. "You are, without a doubt, the most foolish man I have ever represented in my 30 years of practicing law. You did not secure an asset, Marcus. You just signed your own financial death warrant. Did you even bother to read a single page of the documents you forced her to sign? Did you look at the title of the holding company?" Marcus felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his neck. The confident smirk that had been plastered on his face since last night completely vanished. He scrambled out of the bed, his bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. He grabbed his phone and ran out of the master bedroom, rushing down the sweeping, curved staircase toward the kitchen where he had left the manila folder. His breathing grew heavy and shallow as panic began to set in. He burst into the kitchen, the remnants of last night's champagne celebration still sitting on my pristine marble counters. He snatched the thick stack of papers and flipped past the first page, his eyes frantically scanning the dense legal jargon that he had completely ignored just 12 hours prior. "Look at the name of the grantor," Ross demanded through the speakerphone, his breathing ragged. "Look at who transferred the property to you. It does not say Nia Washington, does it?" Marcus stared at the bold black ink on the second page. His mouth went completely dry. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It says Washington Commercial Holdings Limited Liability Company. But that makes no sense, David. This is a house. This is a residential property. We lived here." "It is a commercial entity, you utter fool," Ross shouted. "Your wife is a commercial real estate broker. She outsmarted you on a level I have never seen in my entire career. 3 years ago, she quietly transferred the deed of that residential estate into a commercial holding company. She structured the entire $4 million property as a corporate asset, utilizing a federal tax code known as a 1031 exchange." Marcus gripped the edge of the marble island, his knuckles turning completely white. The luxurious kitchen suddenly felt like a prison cell closing in around him. He did not fully understand the complexities of corporate tax law, but the absolute terror in his lawyer's voice told him everything he needed to know. "What does that mean?" Marcus asked, his voice barely more than a terrified squeak. "It means that by forcing her to sign that property back over to you as an individual, you just ripped apart a legally protected corporate structure," Ross explained, his tone dripping with utter disdain. A 1031 exchange allows an investor to defer paying capital gains taxes on massive commercial sales by reinvesting the profits into a new property. Your wife parked millions of dollars of untaxed commercial profits into the walls of that house. As long as it remained under the LLC, the federal government could not touch it. But the second your pen hit that paper and you transferred the deed to your personal name, you broke the protective seal. You triggered a massive taxable event. Marcus felt his knees go weak. He slumped heavily onto one of the velvet bar stools, staring blankly at the stack of papers that had just ruined his life. But wait, he stammered desperately, trying to find a loophole. The house is still worth $4 million. I can just sell it. I will sell the house, pay the tax penalty, and keep the difference. I can still win this. There is no difference to keep Ross fired back completely, destroying his last shred of hope. Turn to page 12 of the contract you so proudly forced her to sign. Read the clause regarding the Small Business Administration loan. Marcus frantically flipped through the heavy pages, his hands shaking so violently he almost tore the thick paper. He found page 12 and read the highlighted section. The words blurred together before finally coming into sharp, horrifying focus. Your wife did not buy that house with a traditional residential mortgage. Ross continued, delivering the final fatal blow. She financed the acquisition through a commercial lender using a federal Small Business Administration loan. Commercial loans have very strict covenants, Marcus. One of those covenants is an acceleration clause. If the ownership of the corporate entity changes hands without the explicit prior approval of the commercial lender, the entire balance of the loan becomes due immediately. You did not just take on a property tax penalty, you assumed the entirety of her corporate debt. The silence in the kitchen was absolutely deafening. The golden morning light pouring through the large bay windows felt mocking and cruel. Marcus sat frozen, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the disaster he had eagerly invited into his life. He had spent months plotting how to strip me of my wealth, completely convinced that his aggressive tactics would leave me broken and begging. Instead, I had calmly handed him a ticking time bomb, smiled in his face, and walked away before the explosion. Ross took a deep breath on the other end of the line, his voice dropping to a low, deadly serious register. I cannot save you from this, Marcus. Nobody can save you from this. You played checkers with a woman who was playing three-dimensional chess and you lost everything. You have just saddled yourself with $3.5 million in tax debt and SBA loan obligations. Ross declared, sealing his fate. You have 30 days to pay before the IRS comes after you. Marcus hung up the phone and his hands shook so violently the device slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the polished marble counter. The massive empty kitchen suddenly felt like a freezing mausoleum. He needed help immediately. He needed someone who understood finance and corporate loopholes, because the terrifying reality of federal tax debt was completely beyond his comprehension. He scrambled to pick up the phone from the cold floor and frantically dialed Brad. Brad answered on the fifth ring with a groggy, irritated voice, clearly nursing a massive hangover from the expensive vintage champagne they had stolen from my private wine cellar just hours before. Marcus did not even bother greeting him. He demanded that Brad get dressed and meet him at the law offices of David Ross immediately. Brad tried to brush him off, claiming he had urgent morning meetings with high-net-worth clients and could not be bothered with minor legal paperwork. But Marcus screamed into the receiver, telling his brother-in-law that the beautiful mansion was actually a corporate trap, and they were both facing imminent federal charges. That finally got Brad moving. An hour later, the two men rushed through the heavy revolving glass doors of the prestigious downtown law firm. They completely ignored the receptionist and practically ran down the long carpeted hallway toward the corner office. David Ross was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, looking at Marcus with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. Brad strutted into the office, attempting to project the false confidence of a seasoned Wall Street tycoon. He adjusted the collar of his off-the-rack suit, sat down uninvited, and crossed his legs, trying to look entirely unbothered. Listen, David. Brad started using his hands to emphasize his imaginary authority. I work in high-level finance and I deal with complex asset management all the time. My clients face these types of minor tax hurdles constantly. We can just restructure the deed today. We will file a quick motion to nullify the transfer based on emotional duress and roll the property back into a standard residential trust. It is a very simple administrative fix, so there is no need to panic. Ross stared at Brad for a long, silent moment. The veins in the older lawyer's neck were visibly throbbing against his starched white collar. Ross stood up, grabbed a 2-inch thick, heavy binder filled with federal commercial tax codes, and threw it violently across the desk. The heavy binder hit Brad squarely in the chest, forcing him to fumble backward and drop it onto the floor with a loud thud. "It is not a simple administrative fix, you arrogant amateur," Ross barked, leaning heavily over the wooden desk. "You sell penny stocks and manage low-yield mutual funds for clueless suburban retirees. Brad, you do not know the first thing about commercial real estate tax law." The moment Marcus signed that federal deed, he legally assumed the corporate debt of a multi-million-dollar holding company. You cannot just erase a $3.5 million small business administration loan because you feel a little stressed out today. The federal government does not care about your emotional duress, and the IRS certainly does not care about your fake Wall Street pedigree. Brad sat frozen in his leather chair, his face turning a bright, burning shade of crimson. The fake financial genius persona he had carefully crafted to impress my husband and constantly intimidate me instantly crumbled into dust. He looked down at the expensive rug, completely unable to meet the furious gaze of the senior attorney. He had absolutely no rebuttal because he finally realized he was entirely out of his depth. Marcus watched his arrogant brother-in-law fold like a cheap card table, and the terrifying reality finally set in completely. He had no powerful allies who could save him. He had absolutely no money to pay the staggering tax penalty that was already accumulating interest. His only option left was the one person he had spent the last 24 hours actively trying to destroy. He had to call me. Marcus walked out of the law office, leaving Brad sitting there in silence. He stood alone on the busy downtown Chicago sidewalk. The morning commuters rushed past him, holding their coffees and briefcases, entirely unaware of the man whose life was rapidly disintegrating right in front of them. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he scrolled through his contacts and pressed my name. Miles away, I was sitting in my spacious corner office located on the top floor of my commercial real estate firm. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a commanding, unobstructed view of the city skyline that I had helped shape. My entire executive team was gathered around my large custom oak conference table, finalizing the intricate details of a massive new commercial development project. Valerie was standing right next to me, handing me a stack of architectural blueprints, when my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the glass table. I looked down and saw Marcus calling. A slow, incredibly satisfied smile spread across my face. I held up a single hand, signaling my executive team to stop speaking. The bustling room fell perfectly silent. I pressed the green button and switched the call to speakerphone, turning the volume all the way up so the audio would project clearly across the entire boardroom. "Nia, baby," Marcus said, his voice trembling and soft, completely stripped of the aggressive, dominant bravado he had displayed the night before. "I knew you would answer. Listen, baby, we need to talk right now. This whole thing is just a massive misunderstanding." My staff exchanged wide-eyed glances. Some of my senior brokers, who knew exactly how poorly Marcus had treated me over the years, covered their mouths to hide their amused smiles. Valerie stood perfectly still, her arms crossed over her chest, enjoying every single second of his pathetic downfall. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, steeled my posture, and let him continue digging his own grave for everyone to hear. "We let our anger get the best of us last night, Nia," he pleaded, his voice cracking pathetically as pedestrians walked past him on the city street. "I was just upset about the divorce papers, and I acted completely out of character. You know I love you, right? You know I never actually wanted to kick you out of your own beautiful house. You tricked me, baby. It is not fair that you set me up like this when I was emotional. We can call the lawyers right now and reverse the paperwork. We can go back to how things were. I will drop my demands and you can have the house back. Please, Nia, I am begging you to fix this. The sound of the supposedly dominant patriarchal man sobbing and begging through the speakerphone echoed off the solid glass walls of my office. It was a symphony of absolute desperation. He was desperately trying to manipulate me, playing the ultimate victim after he had spent an entire year cheating on me and actively plotting to steal the financial assets I built with my own bare hands. He expected the old Nia to feel deeply sorry for him. He expected the woman who used to shrink herself to protect his fragile male ego to sweep in, pay his debts, and save him from his own profound stupidity. He thought his tears would wash away the fact that he tried to leave me homeless just 12 hours ago. But that submissive woman no longer existed. The woman sitting in that executive chair was a titan who had learned how to use the law as a lethal weapon. I looked around the room at my team, then leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold glass table. I did not raise my voice. I did not express an ounce of anger or pity. My tone was completely devoid of emotion, sharp and cold as ice. The contract is signed, Marcus, I said, letting the absolute finality of my words sink in. There is no return policy. I pressed the red button, disconnecting the call and ending his miserable performance once and for all. The silence in my office lasted exactly 45 minutes before my private cell phone lit up once again. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the latest quarterly projections for a new commercial development when I saw the name flashing brightly on the digital screen. Evelyn Sterling, my mother-in-law. Marcus and Chloe got their towering entitlement from somewhere, and Evelyn was the absolute source of it. She was a woman who expertly hid her toxic enabling behavior behind wide-brimmed church hats, perfectly tailored Sunday suits, and weaponized Bible verses. I knew exactly why she was calling. Marcus had undoubtedly run out of legal options and gone crying to his mother, expecting her to fix his massive financial mess, just like she had done his entire life. I picked up the phone, leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, and answered without a single hint of hesitation. "Naya, sweetheart." Evelyn began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and a heavy practiced Southern charm. "The Lord placed it heavily on my heart to call you this morning. I have been praying for you, Nia. I have been praying for your spirit and for the sanctity of your marriage ever since Marcus called me in absolute hysterics." I rested my hand on the cool glass of my desk and did not say a word. I let her speak, knowing that the sugary sweetness was just the opening act before the real psychological manipulation truly began. "You know Marcus is completely devastated." Evelyn continued, her tone shifting seamlessly to a soft, scolding rhythm. "He called me in tears, Nia, actual tears. A mother should never have to hear her oldest son cry like that. I know he made a mistake. I know he stepped outside of the bounds of your marriage, and I am not saying that was right. But he is just a man, Nia. Men stumble. Men fall to temptation. The devil works hard to destroy holy unions. As a strong black woman, it is your sacred duty to lift him up, not tear him down. You are supposed to be his peace, his rock in the storm. You are supposed to cover his flaws with prayer and forgiveness, not drag him to the courts and try to leave him out on the street with absolutely nothing." The sheer audacity of her words would have been shocking if it were not so entirely predictable. Evelyn had spent the last decade making creative excuses for her son. When he squandered his college tuition, she blamed the professors for being biased. When he lost his first major corporate job, she blamed his manager for feeling threatened by a confident black man. And now that he had been caught funneling my hard-earned money to a 24-year-old Pilates instructor, she was actively blaming me for not praying hard enough to keep his eyes from wandering. "Nia, are you even listening to me?" Evelyn demanded, her voice suddenly losing the sweet facade and growing sharp and accusatory. "You are destroying a black family. Do you know how hard it is for our men out in this unforgiving world? The system is already designed to break them down, strip them of their pride, and hold them back. And here you are, his own flesh and blood wife, acting like his biggest enemy. You are acting completely cold and heartless. You are letting your career, your money, and your foolish pride ruin a beautiful family. You forced my son to sign away his rights to his own home. What kind of woman does that to the man she vowed to love before God? You need to come home, Nia. You need to drop this foolish legal battle, apologize to my son for humiliating him, and work on your marriage before you push him to an early grave from the stress. Evelyn paused, taking a deep, dramatic breath, fully expecting me to crumble under the heavy weight of her religious guilt trip. She expected me to apologize, to desperately justify my actions, or to burst into tears. She relied heavily on the generational conditioning that told women like me to silently absorb disrespect in the name of loyalty, endurance, and family cohesion. She wanted me to carry the burden of her son's failures because that is exactly what she had done with her own husband. But she had severely miscalculated my breaking point. I took a slow sip of my bottled water, letting the heavy silence stretch out between us for an uncomfortable amount of time. I did not argue scripture with her. I did not try to defend my moral character or explain the deep emotional toll of her son's repeated infidelities. You cannot negotiate with a person who actively benefits from your continuous suffering. So I bypassed the emotional manipulation entirely and went straight for the brutal, terrifying reality. Evelyn. I said, my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of any warmth or submission. You are lecturing me about my moral duty as a wife, but you have absolutely no idea how your son has been funding his life or yours for the past 5 years. What in the world are you talking about? She snapped defensively, her tone rising with indignation. My son is a hard-working corporate director. He provides for his family. He has always been a provider. Your son is an oversized child who has been playing dress-up with my corporate credit limit. I corrected her sharply, slicing right through her delusion. Let us talk about reality, Evelyn. Let us talk about the brand new pearl white Cadillac SUV you drive to church every single Sunday to show off to the congregation. The lease on that car is completely in my name. Let us talk about the $5,000 tithe you proudly dropped in the offering plate last month so the pastor would mention your generosity from the pulpit. That money came directly from my commercial dividend check. Marcus has not paid a single utility bill, mortgage payment, or car note since before the pandemic. He has been entirely subsidized by the career that you just had the nerve to call cold and heartless. There was a sudden, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, but I did not stop. I was finally dismantling the grand, luxurious illusion they had all been living in, and I wanted her to feel every single piece of it falling down around her. You want to know why I let him sign that paperwork? I continued, my tone dropping to a sharp, clinical precision that echoed through my office. Because Marcus thought he was stealing a $4 million house from a heartbroken, desperate wife. He thought he was outsmarting me. What he actually did was legally assume the corporate liability of a commercial holding company. He triggered a massive federal tax penalty and a multi-million-dollar loan acceleration. He is drowning Evelyn, and he dragged himself to the absolute bottom of the ocean because his greed and his ego were much louder than his common sense. Evelyn tried to interrupt, sputtering over her words, her voice shaking with a mixture of rising panic and stubborn denial. Now, Nia, you listen here. You cannot just do this to him. You cannot just cut him off like this. He is your family. You are being vindictive and cruel. I already did, I replied, cutting her off completely. And since we are on the subject of cutting things off, you need to start preparing yourself for a very different lifestyle. The well has completely run dry. The free rides, the luxury designer handbags, the fancy church luncheons you host on my dime, they are all over starting today. You wanted me to be a dutiful wife, Evelyn. Well, my final duty was handing your son the exact consequences of his own disastrous actions. I paused, leaning forward toward the speakerphone to make sure my final words landed with absolute devastating clarity. Mother, instead of praying for me, you should pray for your son's bank account. The bank just froze his credit cards. For a long, agonizing second, there was nothing but dead silence on the line. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head as the horrific reality of her situation washed over her. Then I heard it. The sharp, unmistakable sound of fine crystal glass slipping from a trembling hand and shattering violently against a hard tile floor. It was followed instantly by a sharp, desperate gasp as the gravity of my words finally hit her. Evelyn realized in that exact moment that the limitless financial safety net she had enjoyed for years was gone forever. She was not just losing a daughter-in-law, she was losing her prestige, her comfort, her luxury vehicle, and her primary source of income. Before she could even attempt to gather her composure, formulate a response, or utter another empty, manipulative prayer, I reached out, pressed the red button, and ended the call, leaving her to sit in the ruins of her shattered reality. I placed my phone face down on the glass desk and took a deep breath, letting the profound silence wash over me. For the first time in years, I did not have to manage an artificial crisis created by my husband or his family. But while I was enjoying the peace of my new high-rise penthouse, Marcus was officially entering a completely different phase of grief. He had moved past the initial shock and landed squarely in absolute frantic desperation. Over the next 2 weeks, the reality of his financial ruin began to manifest in highly visible ways. The luxury credit cards he had relied on to fund his extravagant lifestyle were abruptly frozen. The expensive dinners with his young mistress came to a sudden halt. The private country club revoked his membership due to non-payment. The walls of the $4 million mansion were rapidly closing in on him. He was living inside a masterpiece of modern architecture, but he could not even afford to keep the massive central air conditioning units running. He was sweating in the dark, pacing the hardwood floors, trying to figure out a way to escape the $3.5 million federal debt that was suffocating him. Marcus, being the arrogant man, he was convinced himself that he still had one final winning hand to play. He reasoned that even with the massive tax penalty and the commercial loan acceleration, the physical estate was still worth $4 million. If he could just sell the property quickly, he could pay off the federal debt, satisfy the loan, and perhaps walk away with a couple $100,000 in pure profit. In his delusional mind, he thought he was about to flip my trap into a massive payday. He completely ignored his high-priced lawyer who had already dropped him as a client due to unpaid legal fees and decided to take matters into his own hands. He contacted a discount real estate broker, desperate to keep the commission fees as low as possible. He instructed the broker to list the property slightly below market value to guarantee an immediate cash offer. The strategy actually worked. The house was a pristine, custom-built estate in one of the most highly coveted neighborhoods in the entire state. Within 48 hours, a wealthy international investor submitted an all-cash offer for $3.8 million. Marcus was absolutely ecstatic. He popped open a cheap bottle of beer, having run out of my vintage champagne, and celebrated his imaginary victory in the empty kitchen. He genuinely believed he had successfully outmaneuvered me once again. He thought he had found the ultimate loophole. A week later, Marcus walked into the sleek downtown office of the title company, dressed in one of his tailored suits, projecting the false image of a triumphant businessman. He sat down at the large mahogany conference table, ready to sign the closing documents, collect his massive wire transfer, and finally be free of the crippling federal liability. The escrow officer, a stern older woman with thick glasses, walked into the room carrying a thin file. She did not look happy. She sat down across from Marcus and slid the file across the polished wood surface without offering a single congratulatory smile. "We have a major problem, Mr. Sterling," the escrow officer said, tapping her pen against the closed folder. "We cannot process the sale of this property. The title search came back, and there is a massive cloud on the deed." Marcus scoffed, leaning back in his leather chair and waving his hand dismissively. "That is impossible." he insisted, his voice dripping with condescension. "I hold the absolute deed to the property. My ex-wife signed the quitclaim deed, transferring total ownership to me weeks ago. It is fully notarized and recorded with the county clerk. There is nothing stopping this sale. You hold the deed to the physical structure, Mr. Sterling," the officer corrected him, adjusting her glasses. "But you do not hold the unilateral authority to liquidate it. When your wife transferred this property into her commercial holding company 3 years ago, she also placed a protective encumbrance on the title. The property is bound by an irrevocable family escrow trust." Marcus felt his stomach drop out completely. The confident smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a pale, sickly expression. "What exactly does that mean?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly as he leaned forward. "It means that any sale, transfer, or liquidation of this specific asset requires the explicit legal approval and signature of the designated trust administrator," the officer explained, reading directly from the legal document. "You took on the financial liability of the property when you forced the deed transfer, but the protective trust remains entirely intact. You cannot sell this house to the cash buyer. You cannot sell it to anyone at all unless the trust administrator signs the release forms." Marcus began to sweat profusely, soaking the collar of his expensive dress shirt. "Who is the administrator?" he demanded, his voice rising in sheer panic. "Who do I need to call to get this signature?" The escrow officer flipped the page and read the name aloud. "The primary administrator of the trust is listed as Malik Washington." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow to the chest. Malik was my younger brother. He was a brilliant, meticulous, certified public accountant who loved me fiercely and absolutely despised Marcus. For years, Marcus and his pretentious family had looked down on Malik, mocking his quiet demeanor and his refusal to participate in their flashy, materialistic lifestyle. Marcus used to make cruel jokes about Malik, calling him a glorified calculator and insisting that he lacked the ambition to ever be successful. Now that same young man held the absolute key to Marcus' survival, and there was not a single chance in the world that Malik would ever turn that key. Marcus stood up so quickly, his chair tipped over and crashed onto the floor. He grabbed his phone and desperately dialed Malik. The phone rang 3 times before going straight to a customized voicemail, perfectly polite but entirely unreachable. Marcus realized with absolute horrifying clarity that the door had just slammed completely shut. The trap was not just a financial burden. It was a perfectly constructed labyrinth with no exit. He was entirely powerless. He stumbled out of the title company office and drove back to the massive empty estate, feeling like a prisoner returning to a luxurious cell. He walked through the grand foyer, the silence of the empty house mocking him at every single turn. He had used this very house to humiliate me, to strip me of my dignity, and throw me out onto the street. Now that same house was slowly bankrupting him, and he was legally bound to it. He could not afford to keep it, and he was legally forbidden to sell it. Every single day, the interest on the $3.5 million commercial loan compounded, adding thousands of dollars to his inescapable debt. Days bled into weeks, and the absolute isolation began to rot his arrogant mind. He stopped answering phone calls from his brother-in-law, Brad, who was dealing with his own massive financial fallout. He stopped returning calls to his mother, Evelyn, who was relentlessly demanding to know when her car payments would resume. The young Pilates instructor he had sacrificed his marriage for completely stopped texting him the moment the expensive gifts stopped arriving. He was completely alone, trapped inside a $4 million cage built exactly to his specifications. Then, the final devastating blow arrived. Marcus walked out to the ornate iron mailbox at the end of the long driveway. He pulled out a thick stack of past due notices and collection warnings. Hidden among the colorful, threatening envelopes was a crisp white envelope bearing the official seal of the United States government. His hands shook violently as he tore the envelope open and unfolded the thick stationery. It was an official court summons from the Internal Revenue Service. The federal government was demanding his immediate appearance in federal tax court to address the massive unfulfilled liabilities connected to the broken corporate exchange. The letter stated in stark black and white text that failure to comply or produce the required funds would result in immediate asset seizure and potential criminal prosecution for tax evasion. He collapsed onto his own front lawn, the perfectly manicured grass pressing against his expensive suit. He was completely out of time. The government was coming for him, and he had absolutely nothing to give them. In a state of pure adrenaline-fueled panic, his mind raced for any possible way out. He knew he could not outsmart my lawyers. He knew he could not bypass my brother. His only remaining option was to corner me personally. He needed to find a way to trap me in a room and publicly humiliate or guilt me into undoing the damage before the federal agents showed up at his front door. He pulled out his phone and stared at the calendar. The annual 4th of July family cookout was only a few days away. It was a massive gathering, usually hosted by his mother, Evelyn, attended by dozens of extended family members, church elders, and community leaders. He knew I would never willingly attend a function with his toxic family, but he also knew exactly how to manipulate the situation to ensure I would be forced to show up. He was going to set a trap of his own, completely unaware that he was simply inviting the executioner to his own financial funeral. The invitation came in the form of a thinly veiled threat disguised as a formal legal notice. Marcus had his new bargain bin lawyer send a certified letter to my office claiming they were preparing to file a massive civil lawsuit against my brother Malik for supposed breach of fiduciary duty regarding the trust. I knew the lawsuit was completely baseless and would be thrown out of court in 5 minutes, but Marcus added a handwritten sticky note to the file. The note said, "We could settle this quietly and keep Malik out of it if I attended the annual Independence Day family cookout to discuss a private reconciliation." He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess, forcing my hand by threatening the brother I fiercely protected. What he did not realize was that I had already prepared the final nail for his coffin, and he had just provided the absolute perfect public venue for me to hammer it in. I pulled my Range Rover up to the towering iron gates of the estate on the 4th of July. The sweeping driveway was packed with the luxury leased vehicles of his extended family. As I walked around the side of the massive property toward the expansive backyard, the heavy summer air was thick with the smell of hickory wood smoke, grilling meat, and absolute hypocrisy. The patio was swarming with aunts, uncles, and cousins dressed in coordinated red, white, and blue outfits. Classic rhythm and blues music blasted from the outdoor surround sound speakers I had personally installed 2 summers ago. Marcus had clearly spared no expense trying to maintain the illusion of his wealth, using the last remaining shreds of his credit to cater a massive party at the house he was secretly losing. The moment my designer heels clicked against the custom stone patio, the music seemed to drop in volume, and the casual conversations ground to a sudden halt. Every head turned in my direction. The judgmental stares from his relatives were heavy and unapologetic. His aunts whispered behind their plastic cups of sweet tea, completely convinced by the narrative Evelyn had undoubtedly spun for them. To them, I was the bitter, scorned woman who had tried and failed to take her successful husband's home. I was the angry villain who lacked the grace to keep a marriage together. I did not shrink under their collective gaze. I adjusted my designer sunglasses, kept my spine perfectly straight, and walked right through the crowd with the serene confidence of a woman who held every single one of their secrets. Evelyn was holding court near the massive outdoor grilling station, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and an expression of pure righteous indignation. She watched me approach with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She did not offer a greeting. She simply looked me up and down and let out a loud theatrical sigh meant for the entire patio to hear. She was playing the role of the exhausted matriarch suffering through the presence of a rebellious daughter-in-law. Chloe stepped out from behind her mother, holding a plate of barbecue ribs with a sickeningly sweet smile plastered across her face. She was wearing a designer sundress she had purchased on my dime last spring. "Well, look who finally decided to show up!" Chloe said, her voice loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "We honestly thought you would be too embarrassed to show your face, Nia. But Marcus is such a forgiving man. He really just wants peace for the family. He is willing to be the bigger person and let you apologize so we can all move past this ugly phase." I looked at Chloe, then looked past her to where Marcus was standing near the outdoor bar. He was sweating heavily, his eyes darting nervously around the yard. He did not look like a forgiving man offering peace. He looked like a trapped animal, desperate for a way out. He was clutching a glass of bourbon so tightly his knuckles were completely white. Before I could even formulate a response to Chloe, her husband Brad pushed his way through the crowd to take control of the situation. Brad was wearing a crisp white linen shirt, unbuttoned slightly at the collar, trying desperately to project the effortless wealth of a seasoned investor. He strutted over to the patio table where I was standing, flanked by Marcus and Chloe, like he was the lead negotiator in a corporate buyout. The surrounding relatives leaned in closer, eager to watch the wealthy white finance brother-in-law put the arrogant black ex-wife firmly in her place. Brad rested his hands on the table, leaned forward, and gave me a smile filled with pure, unadulterated condescension. "Listen, Nia, we all know why you are really here," Brad said, his voice projecting loud enough to ensure he had a captive audience. "You played a cute little trick with the property deed, and you managed to cause a minor administrative headache for Marcus. It was a decent bluff, I will give you that. But the game is officially over. You do not have the capital to fight us in a protracted legal battle, and Marcus is tired of dealing with your petty vindictive tantrums. We are prepared to offer you a very generous exit strategy, so you can leave with some dignity." Brad snapped his fingers dramatically in the air. Marcus jumped slightly at the sound, reaching into his tailored suit jacket with a trembling hand. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to his brother-in-law. Brad flattened the paper out on the glass patio table and slid it directly toward me with a smug look of absolute triumph. It was a certified cashier's check. "Take this money," Brad commanded, his tone dripping with absolute arrogance as he pointed at the paper. "Sign the cancellation of that troublesome LLC case right now. Release the escrow trust, tell your brother to sign the documents, and walk away from this property completely. Do not try to play strong woman, Nia. You are simply not at my level to play legal games with me." The surrounding family members murmured in quiet agreement, practically swooning over Brad's commanding presence. They thought I was being handed a royal pardon. They thought I was a desperate woman about to snatch the money and run away in shame, finally put in my proper place by a man who understood the real world of finance. They stared at me with smug satisfaction, waiting for me to lower my head and admit total defeat. I looked down at the crisp piece of paper resting on the glass table. The check was written out for exactly $50,000. It was an absolute insult wrapped in a profound delusion. They were trying to buy their way out of a $3.5 million federal tax catastrophe. With $50,000 they had probably scraped together by completely emptying their remaining retirement accounts or taking out high-interest predatory loans. They actually believed that a woman who ran a multi-million-dollar commercial brokerage would be intimidated into surrendering her greatest asset for the price of a mid-range sedan. I reached out and picked up the check. I held it gently between my manicured fingers, lifting it up to the bright summer sunlight as if I were studying a rare and fascinating artifact. The entire patio was dead silent, waiting for my tearful surrender. Evelyn was practically glowing with pride. Chloe was smirking behind her plastic cup. I looked at Brad, taking in his cheap linen shirt and his unearned superiority. Then I looked directly at Marcus, whose face was completely pale and slick with panicked sweat, because he knew exactly what was coming next. I lowered the check, tilted my head back, and burst into loud, uncontrollable laughter. The sound erupted from my chest, echoing loudly across the entire manicured lawn, slicing right through the thick tension of the barbecue. It was not a polite chuckle, but a full-bodied, roaring laugh of absolute disbelief. The smug smiles on the faces of his relatives instantly vanished, replaced by absolute, stunned confusion. As they watched the woman they thought they had just defeated laugh right in their faces. My laughter finally subsided, leaving behind a sharp, terrifying smile that completely unsettled everyone standing on the patio. Brad dropped his hand to his side, his face turning a dark, angry shade of crimson. His fake corporate composure was entirely shattered by my refusal to play the submissive victim. He stepped forward, trying to use his height to intimidate me, demanding to know what was so incredibly funny about a $50,000 settlement. I did not answer him immediately. Instead, I turned my back on him and walked slowly toward the massive custom stone barbecue grill where a thick bed of hickory coals was burning a bright, angry orange. The heat radiating from the grill was intense, but it was nothing compared to the absolute fury I had been keeping bottled up inside my chest for months. I stopped right in front of the open flames. Evelyn took a nervous step back, clutching her wide-brimmed hat, as if my very presence might suddenly set her on fire. I held the certified check between my index and middle finger, raising it up so that every single aunt, uncle, and cousin gathered in the backyard could see it clearly. Then, without a single second of hesitation, I lowered my hand and held the corner of the thick bank paper directly against the hot iron grates of the grill. The paper caught fire instantly. A bright yellow flame shot up, consuming the ink and the signatures. Brad let out a loud shout of disbelief, reaching his hand out as if he were actually going to plunge his arm into the fire to save the money. I simply let go, watching the $50,000 bribe turn into worthless black ash that floated up into the heavy summer sky. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Brad yelled, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "That was $50,000 in cash. We were trying to throw you a lifeline, you ungrateful woman." I dusted the tiny specks of ash off my manicured fingers and turned back to face the stunned crowd. I looked directly at Marcus, who looked like he was about to vomit right there on the pristine stone patio. "A lifeline," I echoed, my voice carrying effortlessly over the low hum of the rhythm and blues music still playing from the outdoor speakers. "You think $50,000 is a lifeline? That amount of money is absolutely nothing to me, Brad. But more importantly, that amount of money is absolutely nothing to the Internal Revenue Service." The entire family stared at me in complete silence. They did not understand the reference, but the absolute terror written all over Marcus' face told them that something was horribly wrong. I began to slowly pace around the patio table, taking complete control of the space, forcing them all to physically turn and watch me. "Your golden boy did not tell you the truth," I announced, projecting my voice, so that even the relatives standing by the swimming pool could hear every single word. "He told you I was being vindictive. He told you I was trying to steal his wealth. But Marcus has no wealth. Every suit he wears, every car he drives, every expensive cut of meat you are eating right now was paid for by my company. And when he decided to force me to sign the deed to this house, he accidentally triggered a commercial loan acceleration. Your perfect, successful son is currently drowning in a $3.5 million federal debt." A collective gasp echoed across the patio. Aunts covered their mouths and uncles suddenly put down their drinks. Evelyn stumbled backward, grabbing the edge of the brick grilling station for physical support. Her eyes darted toward Marcus, desperately waiting for him to confidently deny my claims. But Marcus just stood there, frozen in shame, staring down at his expensive leather shoes. "That $50,000 check you just tried to give me?" I continued, stopping right in front of Brad and looking him dead in his eyes. "That would not even cover a single month of the interest and penalties your brother-in-law currently owes the federal government. You are not Wall Street investors. You are broke, desperate frauds playing dress-up in my house." Brad opened his mouth to argue, but absolutely no words came out. His chest heaved as he realized that I knew exactly how pathetic their financial situation truly was. But I was not finished. The financial devastation was just the appetizer. I reached into my designer leather tote bag and pulled out my iPad. "We are done talking about money," I declared, my voice turning ice cold. "You all brought me here to talk about family values. You brought me here to talk about my moral failings as a wife and how I needed to be a bigger person. So let us talk about morality. Let us talk about exactly what kind of people I have been dealing with while I was working 80-hour weeks to keep this entire family living in the lap of luxury. I walked purposefully over to the massive outdoor entertainment center. Marcus had installed a custom 80-inch high-definition television screen right above the outdoor patio bar. I picked up the HDMI cable resting on the counter and plugged it directly into the side of my iPad. The television screen flickered for a brief second before my tablet display mirrored perfectly onto the massive monitor. I tapped the screen, opening a hidden folder labeled Security Archives. Marcus finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He lunged forward desperately, reaching out to grab the cable. "Stop it, Nia!" he shouted, his voice shrill and panicked. "You do not have the right to do this. Turn that off right now." Before he could even take 2 steps, my older cousin David, a man who had always respected my work ethic, stepped right into Marcus' path and shoved him hard in the chest. "Let the woman speak," David commanded, his deep voice echoing across the yard. I tapped the first video file, and the footage began to play in stunning high definition. The timestamp in the corner of the screen showed a date from exactly 3 months ago. It was the weekend of my grandmother's funeral, a time when I was completely consumed by grief and surrounded by my own family in another city. The security camera angle clearly showed the grand marble foyer of this exact house. The heavy mahogany front door opened, and Marcus walked inside, laughing loudly. But he was not alone. Right behind him was a blonde 24-year-old Pilates instructor wearing one of my expensive silk robes that she had clearly left at the house during a previous visit. The camera caught them kissing passionately right in the middle of the entrance hall before Marcus lifted her up and carried her up the main staircase toward my master bedroom. The reaction from the patio was instantaneous and explosive. Several female relatives groaned in absolute disgust. Evelyn closed her eyes tightly, shaking her head back and forth as if refusing to look at the screen would somehow make the horrific betrayal disappear. Chloe tried to intervene, raising her hands to defend her brother. "Okay, so he made a mistake," Chloe yelled, trying to shout over the angry murmurs of the extended family. "You worked all the time, Nia. You neglected him. Men have needs, and you were never here. It does not mean you have to destroy him." I did not yell back at her. I just smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that made the blood drain entirely from her face. "Oh, Chloe," I said softly, "I am so glad you decided to speak up, because the next video is just for you." I reached out and swiped my finger across the glass screen of the tablet. The first video vanished, replaced instantly by a second security recording. The camera angle was different this time. It was the discreet camera I had installed in the upstairs hallway, pointing directly at the double doors of my master bedroom. The timestamp showed a Tuesday afternoon from just last month. Marcus was at work. I was at my corporate office downtown. The house was supposed to be completely empty, but the video clearly showed the upstairs hallway. The relatives leaned in closer, squinting at the large television screen. A few seconds into the recording, Chloe and Brad tiptoed into the frame. They looked around nervously, whispering to each other, before Brad reached out and turned the brass handle of my bedroom door. They disappeared inside my private sanctuary. The video skipped forward on a motion sensor delay, picking up exactly 7 minutes later. The bedroom doors opened again. Chloe hurried out looking panicked but victorious. Right behind her was Brad, and clearly visible in his right hand before he hastily shoved it into his jacket pocket was a long, dark blue velvet box. It was the exact custom velvet box that held my diamond necklace and matching earring set, a jewelry set valued at over $100,000. A collective shockwave ripped through the family cookout. The aunts who had been whispering about my lack of grace were suddenly staring at Chloe and Brad with absolute unmasked horror. Stealing from family was the ultimate unforgivable sin in this community. And they had not just stolen anything. They had sneaked into my private bedroom like common street thieves to rob the woman who was already paying for their entire lifestyle. Chloe let out a high-pitched whining noise, stumbling backward and grabbing Brad's arm. "That is edited," she stammered, her voice shaking so badly she could barely form the words. "She is lying. She faked that video to make us look bad because she hates us." Nobody believed her. The pristine high-definition footage was completely undeniable. You could clearly see the distinctive logo on the velvet box and the guilty, terrifying expressions on both of their faces. Brad looked completely pale, practically shrinking into his cheap linen shirt, as the furious eyes of dozens of relatives locked onto him. "I did not fake anything, Chloe," I said, my voice slicing through the thick, heavy air. "You stole $100,000 worth of diamonds from my vanity drawer. You sold them to cover the massive losses Brad suffered in his fraudulent stock portfolios. You stood in my kitchen, drank my champagne, and called me an uncultured outsider while you were wearing a diamond tennis bracelet I bought you and carrying the guilt of robbing my bedroom." Everyone at the party fell completely silent. The loud rhythm and blues music that had been playing cheerfully in the background suddenly cut off abruptly as my cousin David reached over and yanked the power cord directly out of the speaker system. The silence that followed the unplugging of the speaker system was absolute and suffocating. You could hear the sizzle of the barbecue grill and the distant chirp of summer cicadas, but not a single human voice dared to break the tension. Cousin David stood with his arms crossed, glaring daggers at Brad and Chloe. The undeniable proof of their betrayal was frozen on the 80-inch screen, casting a harsh glare over the patio. Evelyn looked back and forth between the frozen image of her daughter holding the stolen velvet box and the furious faces of her relatives. Her mind was racing. She knew that in our community, stealing from family was a line you simply did not cross. It meant instant exile. It meant no more invitations, no more favors, and absolute social ruin. Evelyn knew she had to completely derail the narrative before the family turned into a mob. She resorted to the oldest, most reliable weapon in her manipulative arsenal. Without any warning, Evelyn let out a blood-curdling shriek. She threw her hands up into the air, her wide-brimmed hat tumbling onto the stone patio as she aggressively clutched the center of her chest. "Oh, Lord Jesus," she wailed, her voice trembling with theatrical agony. "My heart, my chest is tearing apart." She stumbled backward, knocking over a plastic cup of sweet tea and collapsed heavily into a wicker patio chair. She began taking sharp, ragged gasps of air, throwing her head back and closing her eyes tightly. Marcus and Chloe immediately sprang into action, grateful for the sudden distraction. They rushed to their mother's side, dropping to their knees on the stone floor. Chloe began fanning Evelyn with a paper plate, while Marcus frantically rubbed her shoulders, shouting at the crowd to give them some space. "Look what you did!" Marcus screamed, turning his head to glare at me, with eyes full of fake righteous fury. "You are giving my mother a heart attack, Nia. Are you happy now? You come into our family gathering, you spew your toxic lies, and now you are literally trying to kill my mother." Evelyn let out another dramatic groan, leaning heavily against her son. "It is a lie," she gasped, squeezing the words out between her fake hyperventilating breaths. "The devil is a liar and so is she. That video is fake. It is one of those computer-generated deepfakes I saw on the morning news. She manufactured it to frame my beautiful daughter because she is bitter and jealous. She is a demon sent to destroy this family." The performance was almost award-winning. In the past, a scene like this would have instantly shifted the dynamics of the room. The older aunts would have rushed over with cold compresses and glasses of water. The uncles would have scolded me for causing such unnecessary stress to an elder. I would have been pressured to apologize, to put away my tablet, and to beg for forgiveness just to keep the peace. Evelyn was banking on that exact generational conditioning. She was banking on the fact that Black women are taught to instantly fold in the presence of an elder's tears. But I was entirely done folding. I stood perfectly still, watching the three of them huddle together in their pathetic circle of lies. I did not rush forward to help. I did not apologize. I reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out my cell phone. With a perfectly steady hand, I tapped the screen 3 times and pressed the green call button. I turned the volume all the way up and held the phone out in front of me so the entire patio could hear the loud piercing rings. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice rang out crystal clear, cutting through Evelyn's dramatic groans. Yes, I need immediate medical and police assistance at a residence. I said, my voice completely calm and clinical as I read off Marcus' address. We have an elderly woman experiencing severe acute cardiac distress. She is clutching her chest and struggling to breathe. Evelyn peeked one eye open, her groans suddenly dropping in volume as she realized exactly what was happening. I also need law enforcement officers dispatched to the exact same location. I continued, never breaking eye contact with Evelyn. This medical emergency was triggered immediately after the woman and her children were publicly exposed on video for committing grand larceny. I have high-definition security footage of a felony theft in progress. The suspects are currently on the scene and using this medical episode to try and evade legal accountability. Please send a squad car immediately to secure the stolen property and assist the dying woman. The dispatcher confirmed that both an ambulance and a police cruiser were en route. I pressed the end call button and slipped the phone back into my bag. I crossed my arms over my chest and looked down at the 3 of them. The paramedics are 3 minutes away, Evelyn, I said, my tone dripping with absolute lethal sweetness. And the police are right behind them. They are going to hook you up to an electrocardiogram right here on the patio. When they see that your heart rhythm is perfectly normal, they are going to arrest you for filing a false emergency report. And then they are going to arrest your daughter and your son-in-law for felony theft. So I suggest you figure out how to breathe very quickly. The word police hit the wicker patio chair like a bolt of lightning. The survival instincts of a woman desperate to avoid public arrest completely overrode her commitment to the theatrical performance. The ragged gasping stopped instantly. The clutching of the chest ceased. Evelyn opened both of her eyes, blinking rapidly as she looked at my completely unbothered face. In a miraculous display of instant medical recovery, Evelyn sat bolt upright. She smoothed down the front of her expensive Sunday dress, reached down to pick up her wide-brimmed hat from the stone floor, and cleared her throat loudly. I am fine, she announced, her voice suddenly strong and completely devoid of any pain. It was just heartburn. That barbecue sauce your uncle made is entirely too acidic. I do not need an ambulance. She tried to stand up with dignity, but the damage was already permanently done. The sheer embarrassment and humiliation of her transparent lie hung in the heavy summer air. She had weaponized her health to protect thieves, and I had forced her to expose her own fraud in under 60 seconds. She looked around the patio, expecting her siblings and cousins to offer her some grace, but she found absolutely none. The silence shattered, replaced by a wave of loud, disgusted whispers. The extended family members who had been quietly judging me just 30 minutes ago were now staring at Evelyn, Marcus, Chloe, and Brad with absolute revulsion. Cousin David shook his head, turning his back completely on Marcus. 2 of the older aunts quietly picked up their purses and walked toward the side gate, refusing to even look in Evelyn's direction. The family boycott did not require a formal announcement. It happened instantly, right there on the stone patio. They were being actively exiled from their own cookout. The patio was no longer a family gathering, it was a crime scene. Evelyn sat completely frozen in her wicker chair, stripped of her fake heart attack and her remaining dignity. But the real explosion was brewing just a few feet away. Brad was pacing back and forth, his hands running frantically through his hair. The arrogant Wall Street persona he had worn like a shield for years was completely shattered. He looked around at the faces of the aunts and uncles who were staring at him with pure disgust. These were the same people he had spent years talking down to, mocking their working-class jobs while bragging about his imaginary stock portfolios. Now they knew he was nothing but a petty thief who crept into a woman's bedroom to steal her jewelry. Brad could not handle the public humiliation. His fragile ego snapped, and he immediately turned on the closest target. He spun around and pointed a trembling finger directly at his wife. "This was your brilliant idea. Brad screamed, his voice echoing off the brick walls of the massive estate. "You are the one who told me where she kept the velvet box. You told me she had so much jewelry she would never even notice it was gone. You dragged me into this mess, Chloe." Chloe recoiled as if she had been physically struck. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as her husband publicly threw her entirely under the bus to save his own skin. "How dare you blame this on me?" she shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. "You were the one who was desperate for cash. You were crying in our kitchen at 2 in the morning saying your investors were going to kill you if you did not come up with $100,000 by the end of the week. You begged me to help you find something to pawn." The family gasped again, stepping further back from the couple. But there was one person on the patio who did not step back. Marcus. Marcus had been standing frozen near the outdoor bar, completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of his own catastrophic failures. But Chloe's words pierced through his panic like a sharp blade. He slowly turned his head to look at his sister and his brother-in-law. The realization washed over his face, twisting his features into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You stole $100,000 from my house," Marcus asked, his voice dangerously low. Brad held his hands up, taking a nervous step backward. "Now wait a minute, Marcus. Let us not get crazy here. We are all family. We were just trying to survive." "Survive," Marcus roared, completely losing whatever shred of sanity he had left. "I am facing $3.5 million in federal tax debt. The IRS is threatening to seize my bank accounts and put me in federal prison. And you two crept into my house, stole $100,000 worth of diamonds, and kept the money for yourselves. You did not even offer me a single dime to help save the house." "It was not your house to save," Brad fired back, his own panic making him reckless. "You are a broke loser who let his wife outsmart him. The money was for my business. I am an investor. I needed liquidity." That was the final breaking point. Marcus let out a guttural scream of absolute fury. He lunged across the stone patio, closing the distance between them in a split second. He grabbed Brad by the collar of his crisp, white linen shirt, twisting the expensive fabric in his fists. Brad yelped in terror, trying to push Marcus away, but Marcus was taller and fueled by the adrenaline of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He shoved Brad backward with immense force. Brad's back slammed violently against the side of the hot stone barbecue grill. Brad screamed in pain as the heat radiated through his thin shirt. He swung wildly, hitting Marcus in the jaw. The two men fell to the ground, thrashing and rolling across the pristine patio. It was a pathetic, ugly brawl. The polished corporate director and the fake Wall Street tycoon were rolling in the dirt, pulling at each other's clothes, throwing wild, uncoordinated punches like rabid dogs fighting over a scrap of meat. Evelyn finally found her voice screaming for them to stop, but nobody moved to break up the fight. Cousin David stood with his arms crossed, watching the two men beat each other bloody with a look of grim satisfaction. Chloe dropped to her knees, sobbing hysterically on the grass, begging her brother to stop hitting her husband. I stood perfectly still, watching the glorious destruction of the men who had tried to bury me. I let them fight for a full 2 minutes, letting them exhaust their rage and batter their bodies. When Brad's designer shirt was torn, and Marcus had a stream of dark blood dripping from his nose, I finally decided it was time to end the show. "Enough," I commanded, my voice slicing through the chaos like a whip. The absolute authority in my tone made both men freeze. They untangled themselves from each other, gasping for air, scrambling awkwardly to their feet. Brad was leaning heavily against the patio table, clutching his ribs, while Marcus stood wiping the blood from his face, looking at me with wild, desperate eyes. "You are fighting over $100,000 that never actually existed," I said, walking slowly toward Brad. "What are you talking about?" Marcus panted, spitting blood onto the grass. "He stole the diamonds. He sold them." "Oh, he certainly sold them," I agreed. My eyes locked onto Brad, whose face was rapidly draining of all color. "When I noticed the jewelry missing last month, I did not just file a simple police report. I run a commercial brokerage. I have access to some of the best forensic accountants and private investigators in the state of Illinois. I had them track the serial numbers on the diamonds. They found the pawn shop in less than 48 hours. And then they started looking into exactly where Brad deposited that cash. Brad began to shake his head wildly, raising his hands in a frantic gesture of denial. Do not say another word, Naya. You have no idea what you are talking about. You are violating my financial privacy. You think you are Wall Street Brad. I asked, my voice dripping with pure lethal mockery. You stand in my house, drink my champagne, and talk down to my family as if you are some high-powered financial guru. But you are nothing but a common street hustler in a cheap suit. My lawyer did not just find the pawn shop receipt. He found the financial records for your entire brokerage firm. Chloe stopped crying and looked up at me, her makeup smeared across her face. What records? She asked, her voice trembling. Brad is a successful broker. He manages millions of dollars for his clients. Brad manages absolutely nothing, Chloe. I corrected her sharply, turning to face the disgraced golden child. Your husband does not invest in the stock market. Your husband runs a Ponzi scheme. The entire patio erupted into shocked gasps. Brad let out a strangled cry, burying his face in his hands. He takes money from new investors and uses it to pay off the old ones, I explained clearly, making sure every single person in the yard understood the magnitude of his crimes. He has been faking his quarterly returns for 3 years. But last month, a group of his earliest investors demanded to pull their capital out. They threatened to trigger an SEC investigation if he did not produce their money immediately. That is why he was crying in your kitchen. That is why he convinced you to steal my diamonds. He used the cash from my jewelry to pay off his angry clients just to keep the federal authorities off his back for 1 more month. Chloe stared at her husband, her mouth opening and closing silently. She had married Brad because she thought he was her ticket to effortless generational wealth. She had looked down on her own culture, her own family, and my hard work because she believed she was attached to a financial genius. Now she was staring at a bruised, bleeding criminal who had turned her into an accessory to grand larceny. You lied to me, Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. You told me we were rich. We are ruined, Brad sobbed, sliding down the side of the patio table until he was sitting on the stone floor, completely defeated. Yes, you are, I agreed, my tone completely devoid of any pity. And unfortunately for you, Brad stealing my diamonds did not solve your problem. It only delayed it. Because the private investigator I hired handed all of his findings over to the authorities yesterday morning. I gave them the security footage, the pawn shop receipts, and the forensic accounting of your fraudulent firm. Brad's head snapped up, his eyes wide with absolute terror. You did what he gasped. I told you not to play legal games with me, I reminded him, echoing the exact arrogant words he had spoken to me just 20 minutes earlier. You thought you were dealing with an emotional, heartbroken woman, but you were dealing with a CEO, and I always close my deals. Just as the final devastating reality of my words settled over the shattered family, a new sound cut through the heavy, humid summer air. It started as a faint wail in the distance, but grew rapidly louder with every passing second. The sharp, rhythmic, piercing sound of police sirens echoed from the end of the street. The red and blue flashing lights reflected off the tall trees of the neighborhood, heading straight toward the iron gates of the party. The flashing red and blue lights cut violently through the gathering dusk, casting long, distorted shadows across the pristine, manicured lawn. The heavy iron gates of the estate had been left open for the barbecue guests, and the police vehicles did not hesitate to pull straight through. But it was not the bright, boxy shape of an ambulance that came speeding up the sweeping cobblestone driveway. There were no paramedics rushing out with medical bags to check on Evelyn and her miraculous recovery. Instead, 2 marked city police cruisers flanked a large, unmarked black SUV. The vehicles came to a sharp halt right in front of the grand entrance. The heavy doors swung open, and 4 officers stepped out alongside 2 plainclothes detectives wearing dark suits and stern expressions. They were not here for a medical emergency. They were economic crime detectives, and they moved with the absolute focused precision of men who already had all the evidence they needed. The loud chatter of police radios broke the eerie silence of the backyard as the men walked briskly around the side of the massive house and stepped directly onto the stone patio. The lead detective, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a silver badge clipped to his belt, scanned the terrified faces of the extended family before his eyes locked dead onto Brad. Bradley Jenkins, the detective, called out, his voice deep and entirely devoid of warmth. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest regarding multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and grand larceny." Brad did not try to run. He did not try to deny it. The last remaining ounce of his fake Wall Street bravado evaporated into the humid summer air. He looked like a deflated balloon standing there with his torn linen shirt and his bruised face. He slowly raised his hands in a gesture of absolute surrender. Two uniformed officers stepped forward immediately, grabbing his arms and pulling them roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed across the patio, sounding louder than any music that had played that afternoon. Chloe suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. The reality of seeing her husband treated like a common criminal right in front of her entire judgmental family completely broke her mind. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream and lunged forward, grabbing onto the sleeve of the lead detective. "You cannot take him!" she shrieked, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "He is a good man. He is a legitimate broker. She set us up. My sister-in-law set us up." The detective easily brushed her hand away, giving her a look of profound annoyance. "Ma'am, I strongly suggest you step back right now unless you want to be charged with interfering with a federal arrest," he warned sharply. "And considering your face is clearly visible on the high-definition security footage committing felony theft of a diamond necklace, you should probably contact a defense attorney immediately. We will be in touch with you very soon." Chloe gasped, stumbling backward as if she had been shot. She looked around desperately at her aunts and uncles, begging them with her eyes to intervene to protect her the way they always had when she was growing up. But the family members physically stepped away from her, parting like the Red Sea. In our community, nobody was going to stand in the way of federal agents to protect a man who stole money and a woman who robbed her own family. Cousin David actually turned his back completely, taking a slow sip of his sweet tea, while the officers marched Brad away across the lawn. Evelyn remained frozen in her wicker chair, too terrified of her own potential legal troubles to say a single word to defend her favorite daughter. Brad was shoved into the back of the marked cruiser. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing his fate. The vehicles reversed down the driveway, the flashing lights slowly fading into the distance, leaving behind a patio completely destroyed by the weight of the truth. Marcus was left standing completely alone. The invisible fortress of privilege, arrogance, and familial protection that he had hidden behind his entire life had just been leveled to the ground. His mother was exposed as a manipulative fraud. His sister was a humiliated accomplice to a felony. His brother-in-law was on his way to a federal holding cell, and the extended family he had invited to witness my downfall was now looking at him with absolute unmasked contempt. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The smug, self-satisfied grin he had worn the night he forced me to sign the quitclaim deed was entirely gone. His expensive tailored suit was covered in dirt and grass stains from his pathetic brawl with Brad. His face was bruised and his spirit was completely broken. He realized with terrifying clarity that there was no one left to save him. The $3.5 million tax debt was a ticking time bomb, and he was chained directly to it. Marcus' legs finally gave out. Right there in front of his mother, his cousins, and the elders of his church, the man who had demanded my absolute submission collapsed completely. He dropped to his knees on the perfectly manicured grass, the physical manifestation of his total defeat. "Nia, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. He clasped his hands together in front of his chest, looking up at me with tears streaming down his bruised face. Please, I am begging you. Call your lawyer. Call your brother Malik. Tell them to release the trust. Tell them to reverse the paperwork. I will do anything you want, Nia. I will sign whatever you put in front of me. I will leave the state, and you will never have to see my face again. Just please do not let the government take me away. Please save this family. I looked down at the man I had once promised to build an empire with. He was crying over the consequences of his own greed. He wanted me to fix the disaster he had deliberately created. He wanted the strong black woman to step in, carry the heavy burden, and sacrifice her own peace to protect a man who had never protected her. But I had spent years unlearning that exact toxic expectation. I felt absolutely no pity for the man kneeling in the dirt. I felt only the supreme clarity of a woman who had finally taken out the trash. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward, closing the distance between us. The entire patio held its breath watching the final interaction. I stopped right in front of him. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat or scream. I simply bent down slightly, leaning in close, so that only he could hear the absolute finality in my words. "The house is yours, Marcus." I whispered, my tone cold and smooth as polished marble. "Enjoy it." I stood back up, adjusted the strap of my designer tote bag on my shoulder, and turned my back on him. I did not look at Evelyn. I did not look at Chloe, who was still sobbing on the ground. I simply walked across the stone patio, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement. I walked down the long, sweeping driveway toward my Range Rover, leaving Marcus kneeling in the grass, trapped forever, in the beautiful, expensive prison he had built for himself. Exactly 1 month after the chaotic and spectacular collapse of the Independence Day family cookout, I found myself walking up the wide, concrete steps of the Cook County Family Court building. The heavy, humid air of the summer had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp and completely clear morning. I was wearing a sharp, perfectly tailored charcoal gray designer suit that projected absolute authority and total control. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floors of the courthouse, echoing with the same confident cadence as the day I walked out of that massive $4 million estate. I was not walking alone. I was flanked on either side by 2 of the most ruthless and expensive corporate divorce attorneys in the entire state of Illinois. I had paid their exorbitant retainer fees in cash, and they were fully prepared to legally execute the final phase of my absolute liberation. We pushed through the heavy swinging wooden doors of the assigned courtroom and took our seats at the petitioner's table. The room was cold, sterile, and deeply intimidating, lined with dark oak paneling and heavy leather chairs. It was a place designed to strip away illusions and expose the brutal truth. I sat down, folded my hands neatly on the table in front of me, and waited for the respondent to arrive. 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom slowly creaked open. Marcus walked down the center aisle, and the physical transformation he had undergone in just 30 days was absolutely staggering. The arrogant, flashy sales director who used to spend hours admiring his own reflection in the mirror was completely gone. He looked entirely hollowed out. He had lost at least 15 pounds, causing his once pristine tailored suit to hang loosely off his frame like an oversized garbage bag. His face was pale and drawn, heavily lined with deep exhaustion. Dark purple circles hung heavily beneath his bloodshot eyes, telling the silent story of a man who had not slept a single full night since the Internal Revenue Service sent their first threatening letter. Marcus walked over to the respondent's table, but he was entirely alone. There was no aggressive legal team carrying thick binders of financial documents to defend him. There was no smug defense strategy ready to be deployed. David Ross, the high-powered attorney Marcus had proudly hired to intimidate me into surrendering my assets, was nowhere to be found. My lead counsel leaned over and whispered the confirmation into my ear. Ross had officially filed a motion to withdraw as legal counsel exactly 2 weeks ago. The moment the bank froze, All of Marcus' credit cards and the SBA loan acceleration drained his remaining liquid cash. He became completely insolvent. David Ross was not the kind of lawyer who worked out of the goodness of his heart. When the retainer ran dry and Marcus could not produce a single dime to cover the mounting hourly legal fees, Ross simply packed up his briefcase and abandoned him. Marcus was now forced to represent himself pro se in a highly complex multi-million-dollar corporate asset dispute. He was a man bringing a plastic butter knife to an absolute gunfight. Marcus sat down at his table, his hands trembling so violently that he had to clasp them together just to keep them still. He turned his head slowly, trying to make eye contact with me. His eyes were wide, filled with a pathetic, desperate begging. He was silently pleading with me to call off my lawyers, to show him the mercy he had so violently denied me just a few months prior. I did not give him a single ounce of validation. I kept my face perfectly blank, staring straight ahead at the empty judge's bench, completely ignoring his miserable existence. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and the bailiff instructed the courtroom to rise. Honorable Judge Constance Miller stepped up to the bench, her black robes billowing slightly around her. Judge Miller was an older black woman with silver hair, pulled back into a severe bun, and a reputation that struck absolute terror into the hearts of dishonest litigants. She had sat on the family court bench for over 2 decades, and she possessed an incredibly sharp analytical mind that could cut through legal manipulation in seconds. She sat down, adjusted her reading glasses, and opened the thick case file resting on her desk. The proceedings began with swift clinical efficiency. My lead attorney stood up and presented the facts of the case. He submitted the finalized divorce settlement terms, the certified copies of Marcus' infidelities, and most importantly, the fully executed corporate quitclaim deed that Marcus had forced me to sign. My lawyer clearly explained the federal tax implications, the LLC structure, and the resulting debt that Marcus had legally assumed. Judge Miller listened in absolute silence, her sharp eyes scanning the documents before her, taking in every single detail of the massive financial trap. When my attorney finished, Judge Miller turned her piercing gaze toward the respondent's table. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice deep and echoing with absolute authority, "your former legal counsel filed the required documentation indicating that you assume total liability for this property. Do you have any formal legal defense to present to this court today?" Marcus stood up, his legs visibly shaking. He gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table, knuckles turning white as he desperately tried to find his voice. "Your Honor," he started, his voice cracking slightly, "I need the court to void that property transfer. I need you to cancel the quitclaim deed immediately. I am begging the court to reverse this transaction." Judge Miller raised a single eyebrow, peering over the rim of her glasses. "On what legal grounds, Mr. Sterling?" she asked. Marcus swallowed, hard sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "Because she tricked me." "Your Honor," he pleaded, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "She knew about the commercial loan. She knew about the federal tax deferment. She purposefully let me sign that paper to completely ruin my life. I did not understand what I was signing. I was under severe emotional distress because of the divorce, and she took absolute advantage of my state of mind. It is completely unfair for me to be saddled with a $3.5 million commercial debt for a residential home." The courtroom fell dead silent. My lawyers did not even bother to object. They simply sat back and allowed Marcus to actively insult the intelligence of a seasoned federal judge. Judge Miller leaned back in her high leather chair, keeping her eyes firmly locked on Marcus. She reached out and picked up the original copy of the quitclaim deed, holding it up in the quiet room. "Let me make sure I am fully understanding your argument, Mr. Sterling." The judge began, her voice dangerously calm and methodical. "You are claiming that your wife tricked you into signing this document. Yet looking at the legal drafting signature, I can clearly see that this specific quitclaim deed was prepared by your own former legal counsel, David Ross. You paid your lawyer to draft this aggressively structured transfer. You brought it into the marital home. You presented it to your wife." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but he had absolutely no defense. Furthermore, Judge Miller continued her tone, growing sharper and significantly louder. I have read the sworn affidavits regarding the evening this document was signed. You cornered your wife in her kitchen. You threatened to drain her business assets and drag her through years of brutal litigation if she did not surrender this exact property to you immediately. You were not under emotional duress, Mr. Sterling. You were executing what you believed to be a hostile financial takeover of an asset you did not earn. Marcus practically shrank into his oversized suit. But Your Honor, the taxes, he whispered desperately. The IRS is going to take everything. Judge Miller slammed her hand flat against the mahogany desk, the sharp sound cracking like a whip. Mr. Sterling, you used threats and intimidation to force your wife to sign a legal document in order to seize her property. You were entirely perfectly happy to throw her out onto the street and take everything she had worked for. You thought you were stripping her of her power. Now that you have discovered the property is actually a massive pile of corporate federal debt, you are standing in my courtroom crying victim and asking me to return it to her. She paused, letting her absolute disgust fill the heavy air of the courtroom. The law is not your personal toy. Mr. Sterling, Judge Miller declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. You cannot use the legal system as a weapon to bully your spouse, and then beg the court for a refund when your weapon violently backfires in your own face. You demanded this property. You signed the legally binding contract against the advice of basic common sense. You assumed the debt. Judge Miller picked up her heavy wooden gavel. She looked directly at Marcus, who had completely collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The contract stands. The judge announced, the sound of her gavel slamming down echoing like a thunderclap across the silent room. The property and all associated federal liabilities remain your sole responsibility. The financial settlement is approved and the dissolution of this marriage is hereby finalized. We are adjourned. I stood up from the petitioner's table, buttoned my tailored suit jacket, and walked out of the courtroom without giving Marcus a single backward glance. My legal team flanked me as we pushed through the heavy wooden double doors and stepped out into the bustling corridor of the Cook County Courthouse. The air outside the courtroom felt lighter, completely free of the toxic, suffocating energy that had defined the last decade of my life. I was officially a single woman, completely untethered from a man who had actively tried to destroy my future. A few moments later, the courtroom doors opened again, and Marcus stumbled out into the hallway. He looked like a ghost, dragging his feet across the polished marble floor. He did not even have the energy to look angry anymore. He was entirely consumed by the crushing reality of his massive financial obligations. But if he thought the judge's ruling was the absolute worst part of his day, he was profoundly mistaken. As Marcus reached the end of the long corridor near the bank of elevators, two tall men wearing identical dark charcoal suits stepped directly into his path. They had been waiting silently near the marble pillars, blending in perfectly with the crowd of lawyers and defendants. But they were not local police or courthouse security. They moved with the cold, calculating precision of the federal government. Marcus Sterling, the taller of the two men, asked, his voice echoing slightly in the vast hallway. Marcus looked up, his bloodshot eyes widening in confusion and immediate dread. "Yes," he croaked, clutching his empty briefcase to his chest. "Who are you?" The man reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a shining gold badge. "We are special agents with the Internal Revenue Service. We are here to officially serve you with a notice of federal asset forfeiture and immediate wage garnishment." Marcus physically staggered backward, hitting his shoulder against the heavy bronze elevator doors. "What are you talking about?" he gasped. "I just walked out of divorce court. I do not have anything left. I was going to file for bankruptcy this afternoon." "That is exactly why we are here," the second agent replied, pulling a thick stack of legally binding documents from his briefcase and shoving them directly against Marcus' chest. Your 30-day grace period to resolve the $3.5 million debt resulting from your unauthorized commercial property transfer expired at midnight. Furthermore, federal tax penalties and commercial loans acquired under fraudulent transfers cannot be discharged in standard bankruptcy court. Because you have completely failed to produce the required funds the United States government is stepping in to collect. The agents did not speak with anger. They spoke with the terrifying robotic efficiency of a system designed to crush financial criminals. They informed Marcus that his name had been officially entered into the federal credit blacklist. His personal bank accounts had already been permanently frozen and seized at 8 o'clock that morning. Any future legitimate income he managed to earn would be immediately garnished at the maximum legal rate until the multi-million-dollar debt was satisfied. It was a mathematical impossibility that would essentially keep him in crushing poverty for the rest of his natural life. He would never be able to secure a bank loan, qualify for a mortgage, finance a vehicle, or even pass a basic background check to rent a decent apartment in a safe neighborhood. His arrogance had not just cost him his marriage. It had cost him his entire economic citizenship. But the absolute final blow was the house itself. The $4 million estate located in the prestigious suburbs is no longer your property, the lead agent stated coldly, tapping a specific paragraph on the seizure document. The deed has been officially repossessed by the commercial lender in cooperation with the federal government. The property will be placed into immediate foreclosure and auctioned off to satisfy a fraction of your outstanding liabilities. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you are found on the property after 48 hours, federal marshals will physically remove you and charge you with criminal trespassing. Marcus slid slowly down the side of the bronze elevator doors until he was sitting on the cold marble floor. He was a 40-year-old man sobbing openly in the middle of a crowded public courthouse. "How am I supposed to live?" he wept, burying his face in his hands. "Where am I supposed to go?" The IRS agents looked down at him without a single ounce of pity. "That is not our concern, Mr. Sterling," the lead agent said, turning his back and walking away toward the courthouse exit. "You have 48 hours." I watched the entire pathetic scene unfold from the other end of the corridor before stepping onto the down escalator. I felt absolutely nothing for him. He was harvesting the exact bitter crop he had spent months planting. 2 weeks later, the massive $4 million estate was officially listed on the commercial foreclosure auction block. The bank was desperate to offload the massive property quickly to recoup some of their accelerated loan losses before the end of the fiscal quarter. But the property was completely toxic to traditional real estate investors. Thanks to the brilliant foresight of my younger brother Malik, the underlying land and the structural covenants were still heavily entangled with our family trust. Any outside buyer who tried to purchase the estate at auction would be walking into a legal nightmare, facing years of expensive litigation just to clear the title. The bank knew this, and the commercial investors knew this. As a result, the beautiful, sprawling mansion sat completely untouched on the auction registry, gathering dust and bleeding the bank's resources. That was exactly what Malik and I had been waiting for. I was sitting in my corner office downtown, sipping a freshly brewed cup of espresso, when Valerie walked in carrying a single red folder. She placed it gently on the center of my glass desk, a victorious smile lighting up her face. "We just got the confirmation from the commercial lender," Valerie announced, her voice practically vibrating with excitement. I opened the folder and reviewed the final closing documents. Because no other buyers were willing to touch the complicated trust encumbrances, the bank had reached out directly to my corporate holding company, desperate to negotiate a settlement. I did not offer them the original $4 million valuation. I offered them $1.2 million in pure liquid cash to take the headache completely off their hands. They accepted the offer in less than an hour. Through a brand new corporate entity fully managed and shielded by Malik's legal trust, I repurchased my exact same house. But this time, I bought it back for pennies on the dollar, completely wiping out the previous mortgage and clearing all the federal liens that Marcus had triggered. I had effectively used Marcus' monumental greed to secure a massive multi-million-dollar discount on my own premium asset. I reclaimed my entire kingdom without breaking a single drop of sweat or stepping foot inside a courtroom to fight for it. On his final day at the property, Marcus was forced to pack the pathetic remnants of his life into cheap black plastic garbage bags. He could not afford professional movers. He could not even afford to rent a moving truck. He had to call a cheap rideshare service to come pick him up. He dragged the heavy plastic bags down the long, sweeping cobblestone driveway, the tiny wheels of his broken suitcase scraping loudly against the pavement. The massive estate behind him was dark, completely stripped of its warmth and life. He was heading to the only place that would take him, a cramped spare bedroom in his mother Evelyn's small suburban rental house, where they would undoubtedly spend the rest of their lives bitterly blaming each other for their collective downfall. He reached the end of the driveway and stopped waiting for the economy car to arrive. He slowly turned around to look at the towering brick facade one last time. His eyes fell upon the front lawn, the exact spot where his family had gathered to celebrate their false victory during the barbecue. Planted firmly in the center of the perfectly manicured grass, right next to the ornate iron mailbox, was a bright red and white wooden sign. It read, "Foreclosure Bank-Owned Property. No trespassing," in stark, unforgiving letters. Marcus stood completely still, watching the foreclosure sign blow gently in the late summer breeze. It was planted directly in front of the exact same house where he had once proudly and violently tried to throw his wife out. I am standing on the expansive glass balcony of my new downtown penthouse, looking out over the glittering skyline of the city that I helped build. The evening air is cool and crisp, completely free of the toxic, suffocating weight that used to define my everyday life. I take a slow sip of a beautifully aged red wine, letting the smooth taste ground me in the present reality. The frantic, desperate chapters of my past are officially closed, and the aftermath of that spectacular collapse has settled exactly where it belongs. It has been 6 months since Marcus stood on that manicured lawn and watched the bank reclaim his stolen kingdom. The universe has a remarkable way of balancing the scales when you finally stop trying to hold them steady for people who do not appreciate you. Brad is currently sitting in a federal holding facility, entirely stripped of his tailored linen suits and his arrogant Wall Street persona. He was denied bail. The Securities and Exchange Commission completely dismantled his fraudulent brokerage firm, exposing millions of dollars in stolen assets. He spends his days in a tiny concrete cell awaiting a criminal trial that will inevitably end with a decade-long federal prison sentence. He tried to build an empire on lies, and now his entire world consists of steel bars and scheduled cafeteria meals. Chloe, the golden child who spent her entire life looking down on the working class, experienced the most poetic justice of all. When the federal authorities seized Brad's assets to pay back his defrauded investors, Chloe was left with absolutely nothing. The diamond theft made her a complete pariah in our community, effectively exiling her from the wealthy social circles she used to dominate. To keep herself out of jail and pay off her massive court-ordered legal restitution, she was forced to take a job working double shifts as a waitress at a 24-hour diner out by the interstate. The woman who once mocked me for smelling like hustle and desperation now spends her nights wiping down sticky tables and serving cheap coffee to truck drivers, trying desperately to survive the very real world she used to laugh at. And then there is Marcus and Evelyn, the mother and son duo who believed they were entitled to the fruits of my labor, are now serving a life sentence of their own making. Without my corporate income to subsidize their luxury, Evelyn lost her pristine pearl-white Cadillac SUV and the prestigious social standing she weaponized at her church. She was forced to downsize, moving into a cramped, poorly insulated two-bedroom apartment in a decaying suburb. And because Marcus has absolutely zero credit and cannot pass a basic financial background check, he had no choice but to move into that tiny apartment with her. They are trapped together in a suffocating space, feeding off each other's misery. Evelyn spends her days relentlessly berating Marcus, bitterly reminding him of the luxury they lost and blaming him entirely for their poverty. Marcus is forced to endure her constant, sharp-tongued criticism with absolutely nowhere to escape. His luxury car was repossessed, leaving him to commute 2 hours every day on public transit to a low-level entry sales job. And every single time he receives a paycheck, the Internal Revenue Service immediately garnishes the maximum legal amount, leaving him with barely enough money to buy groceries. He wanted to be the patriarchal head of a massive estate. Instead, he is a broken middle-aged man sleeping in his mother's cramped spare bedroom, drowning in a multi-million-dollar debt that will outlive him. I turn away from the city lights and walk back into my beautiful, quiet home. I set my wine glass down on the sleek marble counter. The silence in my penthouse is not lonely. It is the glorious sound of absolute freedom. Marcus once stood in my old kitchen, slammed a stack of legal documents onto the table, and told me that forcing me to sign that quitclaim deed would break me. He looked me dead in the eyes and promised to ruin my life if I did not surrender to his demands. Looking back on that chilly evening, I realized that he was actually entirely right. Forcing me to sign that paper did break me. It permanently broke the blind, exhausted woman who kept trying to save parasites. It shattered the version of me that believed I had to shrink my ambition to protect a fragile man's ego. It destroyed the dutiful wife who accepted disrespect in the name of family loyalty. And from the ashes of that broken woman, it gave birth to a version of myself that they will never, ever be able to reach. I did not have to scream. I did not have to throw a single punch. I did not shed a single tear in front of them. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that the best way to destroy arrogant, entitled people is not to fight them. The best way to destroy them is to give them exactly what they demand. Hand them the crown they are so desperate to steal, and simply stand back as the sheer weight of their own greed buries them alive. They will always dig their own graves if you just provide them with the shovel. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members or a manipulative relationship to protect your own peace, I want you to know that you are not alone. It takes an immense amount of courage to stop rescuing the people who are actively trying to drown you. Please share your own stories of survival and setting boundaries in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and your experiences truly inspire me. If my story resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to grow this amazing community of strong, independent survivors. Share this video with anyone who might need a reminder that walking away is not a sign of weakness. It is the ultimate display of power. Remember, your peace is your most valuable asset. Never let anyone trick you into signing it away.